Hey gang, I'm going to be going on a 2-week vacation here starting next week, and unfortunately I didn't pre-record or pre-upload a bunch of stuff to fill the gaps, so work's been busy. But this is one that I've been talking about on this channel since the early days, so I thought it might be fun to do this one right now, actually, just try to roll it out to you before I go on vacation. So in the late 90s, me and a couple friends tried to make a game with a lot of the elements that will sound very familiar to those who have followed this channel for any length of time. I felt like this would be as good a time as any to talk about the game I tried to make, why it failed and why I'm a firm supporter of Star Citizen but feel it's not above constructive criticism or adding my 2 cents into the mix. And maybe adding in just a little bit of hope for the future of my own project. So if that sounds good, sounds interesting, let's get this. So I've been talking about this one for a while, and I was waiting on salvaging an old hard drive before I made it. Unfortunately, it turns out that sectors of that hard drive that had the juiciest bits, basically the 3D models and some of the animations that I made during the time, were corrupted. So I guess I should have had a better backup system, but the 90s were the 90s. I have some data on old zip disks, and for y'all who are whippersnappers, zip disks were basically big floppy disks that held a whopping 100 megabytes, so quite revolutionary. I've managed to record or recover some of the images from that time, the rough early concepts and some of the early ship models, which is what you'll be seeing running in the background for most of this vid. So on this project, one of the upsides of being both the concept artist and the 3D modeler was that if I had a good idea at like 3 a.m. in the morning, I could pull out an index card, scribble down a quick gesture drawing of the ship, and even now, 25 years later, I could still picture that entire ship in 3D in my brain. The downside is that now, 25 years later, all of the 3D models that I created were in a cheap, obsolete program that can no longer be converted. So please enjoy my scribbles. Anyways, in the late 90s, I tried to make a game that, at least in its core, was very, very similar to what the core of Star Citizen is. Actually, how about you join me when I take a little step further back? So let's travel into the long, long ago to a little town by the name of Falkenberg Limbach. And no, that shouldn't be censored. That is actually a German word. In the mid-80s. And I swear this journey won't take too long, but it is relevant to the story. As you can see, this was a small town, and there weren't really any kids my own age. So despite being an extrovert, I tended to spend a lot of my free time drawing. While these drawings sometimes covered the usual dragons, there was also some long since lost to time that were inspired by Star Wars. I'd snag long reams of dot matrix paper and draw profile views of ships that would just stretch for pages and pages and pages, basically just that endless scroll that Spaceballs was making fun of, with the whole Star Destroyer coming in over and over and over. It just kept going and going and going. Basically just that as a side scroller. I also spent a lot of time reading, and Heinlein gave way to heavier and harder sci-fi that was beginning to spill out during that time. I discovered William Gibson in the late 80s, then RPGs like Cyberpunk and Shadowrun and MechWarrior shortly thereafter. I had also had games like Traveler in my back burner that were kind of filling that hard SF niche as well. Computer games were still pretty basic back then, mostly side-scrollers, but there were hints of more to come. I made a couple character creators and basic kind of choose your own adventure things where you described your character through a series of multiple choice or yes or no questions, and that would spit out a completed character sheet based on what you had described. As the 80s gave way to the 90s, I decided that most cyberpunk style games were a little too optimistic with the tech while others, like, say, MechWarrior, were too pessimistic. So I started kind of pinning up my own game universe that was kind of a mashup of all the games and books I was reading at the time, along with a fair amount of my own ideas kind of tossed on top, just kind of things that I felt the other IP was kind of missing, or that I didn't agree with, or I thought that I came up with something better. By the 90s, the gaming world was seeing a bubble of revolution. It was around here that I bought my first computer game with my own money. So that would be Wing Commander, it would turn out. I felt it was particularly apropos because my dad happened to be an actual Wing Commander in the Air Force at the time. When I was younger, back in Germany, one of the games we played, my dad and I, was Red Storm Rising, where you command a war between the US and the USSR. And my dad would let me sit on his lap and fire the missiles or hit the occasional key. We'd play the game together. It was a really good memory of my childhood. I guess I kind of wanted to capture that magic again, but Wing Commander was solidly a single-player game, and obviously at that point I was too old to sit on my dad's lap. And my dad's only real interest in it was the fact that it was taking up a gigantic 6 megs of his hard drives. Yeah, I mentioned this was the early 90s, right? Anyways, I swear this journey through history is reaching its end. We flash forward to college in the mid-90s. Of course, by this time, computer games have seen something of a bigger revolution thanks to Doom, then Quake, and then Half-Life, and yeah, the evolving Wing Commander series, and even a little follow-up game called Privateer. It was a heyday for space sims, so on top of Privateer and Wing Commander, you had X-Wing, Independence War, TIE Fighter, and so on. Just a bunch of games in that genre. There were loads of people pushing their way into the genre. Of course, I was just working on art at the time, and my days of programming long character sheets in BASIC were long past. Although I was still building my own computers and had a strong interest in both computers and programming, even though I didn't necessarily have the aptitude for it. Late in college and moving into the later part of the 90s, I found myself in a house with a few roommates that were from a broad spectrum of disciplines, but no few of them were coders. Their outside interests lay in music, however, and one of my friends came up with an MP3 player that had visualizations that reacted to the music you were playing at the time. So again, keep in mind that this is the mid to late 90s, so an MP3 player lived on your computer rather than being a piece of hardware that you carried around with you. But still, Sonic was a neat piece of tech, letting people make custom skins, custom visualizations. It had an EQ equalizer on it, and so on. It was just a pretty neat piece of tech. Enough that it was in direct competition with Winamp and mostly beating it out in features. Of course, my friends working on this thing mostly bailed on college to work on this thing. Me and my other friends kind of thought that that was a weird choice, until they were picked up by a venture capitalist in Seattle who dumped money on them for the tech. They were sold off to Lycos, and boom. Yeah, I mentioned this was the late 90s, right? That kind of thing was pretty common back then. Somebody would make a web page or some small app, and some venture capitalist would come out of the woodwork to chuck money at them in the hopes that it blew up into something big. So those of us that hadn't ridden that wave with them for one reason or another, in my case it was the wrong skill set, definitely saw that and took an interest in maybe grabbing some money of our own with some project. There's a thought that if we could come up with the right idea, a game changer, we could cash in on the whole venture capitalist thing and pave our own way to earlier retirement. The trick was coming up with a game idea or a game-changing idea that no one else had thought of and no one else had done yet. Dragging out my notes for my sci-fi RPG, I began the process of tightening it up and turning it into a design doc for an actual computer game. The killer app, the elevator pitch, if you like that term, was this: Half-Life meets Privateer. You can walk around a fully realized universe in first person and seamlessly enter and fly your ship, take on careers in the military, merchant, mining, mercenary, or even piracy. This is a single-player game with a multiplayer functionality, and if those are successful, will expand into a massively multiplayer franchise. So not bad, right? And kind of familiar for those of you who have followed Star Citizen. But even back then, even in 1998, I knew this idea was inevitable. Someone somewhere would make this idea a reality. If it wasn't us, someone else would, and probably pretty soon. I worked on this idea through my late junior year and most of my senior year, zeroing in on making simpler single-player game that would fund a multiplayer game, provided the first game was successful, and finally realizing the dream of the massively multiplayer game built on the same principles in the same universe. So basically, you'd play the single-player game, then the multiplayer game would come out where you play with a handful of friends, and then it would open up to the massively multiplayer game. The universe itself was kind of cool, if I say so myself, comprised of real-world stars and their real-world positions with as much information as we knew about those systems at the time. The general idea was that, with space travel being so expensive, the richest nations of the Earth formed a kind of unity government in which to explore the solar system. As time went on, this government gradually expanded outwards, encompassing Mars, Jupiter. You get the idea. This is a pretty common trope in sci-fi. There were growing pains, wars in space, and wars on Earth, as many of the poorer nations weren't too appreciative of being left behind and having Earth's dwindling resources being shoved into this move-off planet. Tech was advanced and advanced again. Colony ships were launched off towards Alpha Centauri, moving at 20% the speed of light, which was blazingly fast for the time. Robotic probes had already paved the way. While there weren't any habitable planets in the system, it was the promise of a new system, and a 20-year travel time seemed worth it to get out of the chaos of the Sol system. Tech kept advancing, creating the Ripple drive, which was basically the Le Corbusier drive, which you can find pretty much, just Google that and you'll find loads of videos on it. This allowed for faster speeds, and then, of course, my version of space magic called a jump drive. For my version of the jump drive, at least for the initial first-person story, this jump drive punched a hole out of our dimension, enabling the ship to bounce around the light speed barrier. A trip of light years would take weeks rather than decades. As the tech advanced, the distance that a ship could jump was pushed further out, being limited to around 7 or 8 light years at its maximum. Outside the lore, I figured planet tech was years or probably decades away in reality, so I leaned away from the Star Trek and Star Wars version of intelligent life, or even just complex life, being everywhere on all of these planets, and tons of the planets and moons everywhere being habitable. Instead, I had another tagline that would underscore this fact. And so this was the second one. Moving out into the stars, humanity found no other intelligent life, and finding no aliens, they became aliens themselves. And this is where the cyberpunk element came in, and the influences of games I was playing at the time. Humanity heavily modified themselves to live in a variety of places, most of them space station or harsh moons or planets. Even planets that were Earth-like were still inhospitable to human life, thanks to differences in pressure, atmospheric makeup, or that sort of thing. There were no intelligent aliens, at least none that we had bumped into yet, and there was no evidence of them. Unified under a single flag, at least in theory, humanity pushed out in a bubble that would eventually be around 100 light years across. By this point, though, this interstellar government had become a bit tyrannical and its navy stretched very thin. Not surprisingly, this led to a series of rebellions, a fracturing of the whole thing. Some systems reverting all the way back to anti-tech Luddites that didn't understand the station tech that was, in some cases, barely keeping them alive. Over time, different powers grew out of this roiling chaos, formed their own tiny nations, with a couple growing into true superpowers. Again, wars were fought, stalemates were reached, and human space entered something of a Cold War, with the two superpowers backed by alliances with smaller powers, and a couple neutral parties either trying to broker true peace or stay out of it altogether. And that was where the single-player game would start. The loops are probably familiar. Military, mining, trading, mercenary, and being a pirate. In a way, the plot of the first game was similar to that of Cyberpunk. Kind of think of a reverse tree where you could start from a variety of places, but all of those roads led down to one path eventually. Coming from a world of making my own tabletop RPGs, the thought of balance and progression were baked in pretty early. The military loop would have been pretty regimented and sequential, whereas the others would be a little more freeform. Jump drives could only be installed on the largest ships after all. So players' early experience would mostly be confined to a single system until they learned the loop well enough to progress to a larger ship. This was an early check to make sure players didn't jump into the deep end too quickly, but also give a reason for why warships of the superpowers weren't just jumping deep into each other's territories, as well as control the commerce and trade loops. The ships the player controlled, even the small ones, were considerably larger than those of Star Citizen, with crew sizes that sometimes ranged into the hundreds. Of course, the single player and eventually the multiplayer version were just the bridge crew, which comprised 1 to 10 positions. While the activities of the ship, from engineering to combat, were controlled by the players, they're handled through the ship by NPCs that would mostly be unseen while the players were controlling the ship from the bridge. I got this idea from Independence War, where you control 4 stations of a ship. It was a single player game, but the entire time I played it, I thought about how cool it would be to be playing it with 3 other people, each of you taking one of those stations on the ship. I guess no idea is completely original, as Picasso once said, "Good artists borrow, great artists steal." The backbone of the engine would be real physics, at least as far as we could push them. Obviously, the jump drive itself was fancy. And on the topic of physics, the ships in Oblivion, which is what we called it, were based on physics too, that there was no anti-gravity. And it sounds like that supposition on my part back in the late 90s was actually correct, as they have recently found out that anti-gravity and artificial gravity probably isn't going to be a thing, which is a little bit sad for all the sci-fi geeks out there, but there you have it. But anyway, there had to be a way to generally create gravity in the game, and of course we did that through acceleration. So the layout of the ships on the interior was less like the Enterprise and more like a high-rise, because the acceleration would be going down through the body of the ship. And when the ship was on the float, as they'd say in The Expanse, the ship would actually use spinners and centrifugal force in order to generate a kind of artificial gravity if the ship was big enough. But a lot of the game would probably be in 0G, and that was kind of one of the ideas that we thought would set this game apart, because no other game was doing that at the time. But ships would still need to flip and burn, and space battles would be fought over extremely long distances. Lasers were invisible and could be defeated by throwing out a cloud of sand, for example. Tiny fighters are practically non-existent. You get the idea. The merchant loop was based around the size of the ship, with each ship having its niche. And you'll hear me when I mention Star Citizen that when I start talking about the system, this is the system that I'm basing that on. The smallest ships, the trader class, you could call them starters, stayed local to a specific region. A cluster of specific stations near each other, a planet and its moon or moons. Freighters, which were a hair larger and traded between the planets or major stations of the system. The next step up was the transport, and traded between major locations and the system station or stations. Effectively, a system station was sitting way out on the edge of the system, either at the apogee or the perigee of the system, as a way of kind of getting out of the bustle of the inner system. And these were huge stations that were used to trade with other systems. And only the largest ships, with a crew of a couple thousand, were capable of carrying and powering a jump drive. And these are the only merchant ships capable of traveling between the stars and going from system station to system station instead of traveling within a single system. In addition to running cargo, these big cargo ships could rent out universal docking rings on their hull and allow smaller ships to latch on. So this would enable a smaller ship to travel system to system as well, even though they didn't have their own jump drive, and it would allow big cargo ships to kind of blunt the cost of operating by charging for that service. Some ships, and I got this idea from CJ Sherry, could carry their cargo externally. So weirdly very similar to the Hull C, although I had the actual cargo pods lock onto each other rather than have big arms that would go out and hold them. But a cargo ship could blow off its cargo and suddenly its mass to thrust ratio would be greatly changed. So it would be able to escape from danger by losing the cargo and would become a much faster ship. I decided to make the mining loop take this idea to the extreme. The largest ships in the mining loop, indeed in the entire game, were the refinery ships, basically stations unto themselves, but they could travel. These were all controlled by the all-powerful mining guild, which was kind of the equivalent of a morally ambiguous megacorp in the cyberpunk genre. Think of them more as House or Conan from Dune, although maybe not quite as blatantly evil. These gigantic refinery ships are typically only sent to the most resource-heavy systems that would justify putting that kind of cost forward. And then they would release a handful of motherships, which were also just ginormous ships, basically on par with the huge cargo ships. Motherships were also capable of jumping, but for much shorter distance than the larger refinery ships. They were kind of the regional government arm of the mining guild, usually holding down and commanding the mining operations in an entire system. With huge cargo stores, the motherships were basically repositories for all the minerals and ores mined in that system. And for their part, most motherships were also run by the mining guild, although there were a handful that were famously independent, often with the permission of the guild itself through the lore. You would learn the names of some of these ships. In essence, motherships were just huge cargo holds for ore, though, and they didn't do the actual mining. Instead, they carried smaller ships that were farriers into the system. Farriers flipped the script by half of them being independent operations, but often taking jobs with the guild. And of course, since they were landing on guild ships, they were typically under the command of the guild regardless. You could think of the farriers as kind of operational systems for local mining operations, and carried two types of smaller ships on their hides: mining scouts and sledges. Of course, when you started controlling these larger ships, you were more controlling the 10,000 foot view of an operation. So you're basically running a corporation and trying to control all of these assets. As you went down to the smaller and smaller ships, it became more and more personal. Like you would actually just be controlling your little niche. And that was another thing that I kind of wanted to build into the game, was that kind of game loop too. For the people that kind of liked real-time strategy games, they'd be percolating up to the bigger ships that kind of controlled the bigger picture, whereas players that kind of like getting their hands dirty would stick to the smaller ships. So much like the trade ships had their niche, the mining ships also had their niche in the kind of player that I was trying to ingratiate myself towards. So these farriers carried two types of smaller ships on their hides: mining scouts and sledges. Scouts were small, highly maneuverable ships that were pretty quick over the short range, enabling them to get to dense, dusty areas, dodge any rocks that might be moving through the area, and snag the good stuff. Even though the asteroid belt in our own system, the rocks are millions of miles apart, or tens of thousands of miles apart, that's not the case in other systems that are much dustier, and smaller micrometeors could still be a problem. These ships are capable of navigating those in the way that the farriers and the larger ships couldn't. These scouts would go out and try to find the most valuable rocks they could. And once these rocks were cracked up by the miners, the sledges would come in from the farrier, load up all of that ore or whatever they had found, and bring them back to the farriers. On the scouts were the actual miners that would go out in EVA, so first person, to drill probes into the rocks to see what they were really made of. So it wasn't beams, it was very, very physical. And then they would break the most valuable parts off by strategically drilling in explosives. Richer ships wouldn't put themselves at risk, but instead would use unmanned drones. Mining was supposed to be a high-risk, high-reward loop, with a lot of things that could go wrong, especially for those that were doing the grunt work. Again, every ship in the chain had its niche, which was kind of the pattern I was going for. Someone could realistically spend the entirety of the game in a starter ship and do just fine and have plenty of fun. There's also the ability to upgrade your ship, and with these larger crews, you'd have to really consider their morale in the equation. So you could kit out your ship with things that would make morale better, where you could hire more skilled crew, or you could actually get the existing crew you had to work more efficiently or better or happier. Mercenary ships ran the gamut from smaller skirmishers up to fairly large warships. While these warships couldn't necessarily compete with the naval ships of the superpowers, in the right system they could certainly hold their own. And pirates, like in Star Citizen, could be in pretty much any of these ships, from miners up to mercenary ships or whatever they wanted to fly. Weirdly, I never even thought of the salvage game loop, and in hindsight, it is a blindingly obvious one. We did have a racing mode planned, although we kind of did this much later when it was clear that we probably weren't going to get funding for the single-player game. And this sort of smaller racing game was heavily inspired by Mario Kart of all things. And we called this one Soul Burner, so SOL, like the Soul system, which is where this racing began. We were constantly trying to think of these smaller, less ambitious projects to act as a stepping stone for the larger projects. So someone could do a small investment and it would allow us to get this project out. Or we could release a small project for free just as kind of a proof of concept. Of course, the history and the fluff of this game is something that I could go on for a long, long time. The history and the story for this game stretched over 1,600 pages. So yeah, it was ambitious, and it was always easier to write all this stuff out in all these design documents than it was to ever really make a game of it. As the dude who made the rule systems for RPGs, and the artist and the writer, is my job to craft this world and provide the backbone and the baseline for the game world itself. In addition to myself, we had a single programmer who had mostly trained himself up for programming servers, trying his best to learn OpenGL and create his own 3D game engine on the fly. And given his limitations, he didn't have a lot of confidence in the engine he was making. And since he was making it on the fly, he limited me to 100 triangles per ship. So these ships you're seeing in the background, none of them have more than 100 polys on them. So having that kind of limitation on me really forced me to be very creative in the silhouettes I was creating for these ships. So not terrible, but I would later learn that 100 polys for a ship is ridiculous. Most hand models in a first-person shooter have more polys than that. And another guy, Sinister, who you'll sometimes hear on this channel, took on the business side. As I was working in HR and payroll, I also handled the planning for the finances, and that last was the easy part, as the goal is to make something that could get funded. So most of my work was theoretical in that venue. We even got a sit down with a venture capitalist towards the end there, but for those who don't know, our timing was awful. The year 2000, along with tons of fears about Y2K, brought on the great .com crash. All that venture capital money dried up pretty much overnight, and the desire of investors to just throw money at anything tech went with them, especially something like a computer game. We did soldier on for another couple years, but our programmer decided to seek greener, more reliable pastures. There were some game engines out there for use, like the UDK, but they were in their infancy, and at this point it is a true uphill climb. At least the dream of making it into a computer game. I tried for a few more years, mostly solo, but when it became clear that it wasn't going anywhere, I decided to bring it back to its roots and launch it as a tabletop RPG. So the dream didn't die, not really. It just evolved. But that game, that type of game, I knew someone somewhere would make it. I said that often as we were developing the game, and there were a few scary moments when other games rolled out that seemed to promise all those elements, so think things like Eve, but then fell short of the scope that we had been aiming for. So I don't want to leave you thinking that it's all bad news. The Dream of Oblivion, the original name we settled on for the franchise, notably named 8 years before the Elder Scrolls snagged the name, lives on in this new project that I'm calling BioShock. This tabletop RPG that I've been whittling away at for the last decade or two. I'm testing the rules on another franchise, but creating the art for that franchise combined with real life commitments, and not to mention my real life job that puts actual food on the table, eats up majority of my free time. So the progress has been slow. I mean, life happens. So right off the bat, with one of the inspirations for my game being Privateer, you can see why when the guy who made Privateer, the core of the inspiration for my own game, kickstarted a game with a real similar premise, it was a no-brainer that I'd back it. I may not be able to play my game, but Star Citizen was likely as close as I'd ever get. And this isn't the kind of game that would be made any other way. It's too big, it's too complex, it's too ambitious. No production company would ever front the time or the money to make a game like this until it was already proven that there was a market for it. And the only way the market gets built is if someone has the time, the money, and the focus to pull it off. For my project, I have no idea how or what we would have actually pulled off if we had gotten funding back in the late 90s. But I'm sure it wouldn't have been this. So in a way, backing CR's dream is backing my own. While it's definitely different in very key ways, being more Star Wars sci-fi fantasy than the cyberpunk hard SF universe I had in my brain, the bones are there. Ever since I was a little kid, lying on that floor at a farmhouse in Germany, drawing huge ships on dot matrix paper, dreaming of a place that ship would exist, dreaming of being able to pilot it or command it, or even just see it. This is the world I wanted to spend my time in. So yeah, I get Chris Roberts' ambition, the desire to see the dream released. It just so happens that it's realizing my dream as well, and the similar dreams of so many of us who grew up in the 80s and 90s. And that's what a lot of us are here for, the dream. And finally, it's starting to look like a reality. And that's all I have for this one, gang. Catch me next time.